This is why I haven't done any interviews. This is why I just kept my mouth shut for a long time. A lot of fighters have been keeping their mouths shut for a long time.
Years of silence have finally broken. UFC fighters are now exposing the system that has kept them underpaid for more than a decade. Champions earning $14,000, athletes going into debt, and stars revealing how little they actually make while the company earns billions. One of the biggest examples is Demetrius "Mighty Mouse" Johnson, an 11-time defending champion who was paid only $14,000 for a title fight, and after taxes, camp costs, coaches, and managers, he walked away with almost nothing, and the problem didn't end there. In 2025, Charles "Energy" Johnson won by knockout in Shanghai and even received a $50,000 bonus, yet he still had a negative bank balance while preparing to become a father. When Ariel Helwani amplified the story, fighters spoke out, analysts reacted, and fans were shocked. But the truth is simple: everyone inside the UFC has known about this issue for years. The UFC knows. Dana White knows. They just haven't bothered to fix it.
You don't like the way we pay our fighters? Too bad. Go start another MMA organization and you go figure out how.
This is basically Dana White's real answer to the fighter pay controversy. No apology, no promise to improve anything, just a blunt "too bad." Now look at the numbers that expose the problem. The average UFC fighter makes around $51,000 a year, and almost half of the roster earns less than $45,000 annually. Meanwhile, the UFC pulled in $1.4 billion in revenue in 2024. The gap is unbelievable. And remember, UFC athletes aren't even treated like regular pro sports players. They're labeled as independent contractors, which means no health insurance, no retirement plan, no guaranteed long-term deals. If a fighter gets injured, it's on them. If their career ends with brain damage, they're stuck with the medical bills. All while the organization keeps growing richer.
Chris Carriasso, let's say I made $150,000, right? And then I'll fight the next challenger, Kyoji Horiguchi, I would make less money.
Another fighter explained the crazy reality of the UFC. Sometimes winning actually leaves you with less money than you started with. How does that even make sense? How can a system punish you financially for moving up the rank?
Because you always get your show and your win. Excuse me, your show and win, right?
Right.
Your show might be $150K, and your win's $50,000 bonus. Typically, it goes up by escalator of $3,000, $10,000, $15,000. It all depends, right? But then when I fought Chris Carriasso, I made, let's say $150,000, and then when I fought Kyoji Horiguchi, I made less. Even though the pay it went up, I still made less money.
Why?
And the reason is simple: pay-per-view points. Only the biggest, top-tier stars ever get them. And even then, the UFC decides who's allowed to appear on a pay-per-view card. This same fighter said he spent years trying to earn PPV points, the only real path to making serious money in this sport.
But if I land on a Conor fight, or if I land on a Conor fight or a John Jones fight or whatever, that's going to bring in 875,000 pay-per-view buys. If you make $350K and then the pay-per-view structure is $0 to $200, $0, $2 to $4, $1, $4 to $6, $1.50, then $6 to $8, $2. You add all that up.
Here's the crazy part. He fought for years just to earn pay-per-view points, and after 11 straight title defenses, he only received them once. Just imagine how much money he lost over time, and the situation gets even sadder when you hear stories like Merab Dvalishvili's. In 2024, he admitted that he was doing construction work until 2020. Think about that, a world-class UFC athlete, good enough to beat top contenders, swinging a hammer between fights because his $10,000 fight purses left him broke whenever he lost. Then you have Stipe Miocic, a UFC Hall of Famer and one of the greatest heavyweights ever. Even he worked full-time as a firefighter throughout his UFC career because the pay simply wasn't enough to rely on.
Why do we keep hearing about the underpaying stuff?
Well, right now in particular, there's probably less money because the fighters have to, there's no gate.
There's no live gate.
Yeah, there's no live gate. And that's an extreme amount of money. But there's also fighters that agree to certain deals.
Even Joe Rogan, the UFC's longtime commentator, has admitted on his podcast that fighter pay is a real problem, even though he often tries to justify the UFC side. But what he says next makes the situation even harder to ignore.
When it comes to me as a human that likes fighting, I know how fucking dangerous that shit is. You should get paid an incredibly generous amount of money to step into a cage fight.
Even Joe Rogan, who is paid by the UFC, admits that fighters deserve a lot more money. But then he immediately switches to defending the business side, claiming that WME, the company that bought the UFC for over $4 billion in 2016, is struggling. Struggling? They just signed a $7.7 billion deal. Hardly sounds like a company in trouble. Meanwhile, some fighters are going into debt even after they win. This is the system Dana White has created and protected for over 20 years, a system where $50,000 bonuses haven't changed since 2006, even though the UFC's value has skyrocketed. A system where new fighters still earn $10, $12K just to show up, barely enough to cover training expenses. When the UFC briefly increased bonuses, Dana called it a mistake and said he'd never do it again because fighters didn't show urgency. Imagine blaming athletes for not performing better when you're paying them near poverty wages. In 2022, Dana White said, "Guys get paid what they're supposed to get paid. They eat what they kill." But when the company's value has risen thousands of %, that statement means nothing because the fighters haven't received anything close to a fair share of that growth. Then came the scandal that changed everything. November 2025. The MMA world erupted, not from a knockout, not from a decision, but from massive fight-fixing allegations tied to an active FBI investigation.
O'clock that day, we're with a company called IC360, and they are the best bet monitoring company in the business. And they reached out to us and they told us that there was some unusual action going on with that fight. Do we know anything? You know, we didn't. So what we did was we called the fighter.
Dana White, clearly alarmed, explained that the UFC was alerted by IC3, a major betting integrity company, about strange betting activity before the Isaac Dolgren vs. Yadier Delval fight. Huge amounts of money suddenly started coming in on Delval. Even though Dolgren was the heavy favorite, the UFC called Dolgren directly, asking if he was injured, in debt, or if anyone had tried to bribe him. He insisted everything was fine and said he planned to dominate the fight. The bout went ahead, and Dolgren was submitted in the first round by a rear naked choke. Sportsbooks immediately refunded bets and froze all prop wagers. And as soon as the fight ended, Dana White contacted the FBI.
Literally, the first thing we did was call the FBI.
The Nevada State Athletic Commission immediately withheld Dolgren's fight purse. He was cut from the UFC, and federal investigators opened a full investigation. But here's the connection to fighter pay. In the days after the scandal, several UFC athletes came forward saying they had been offered money to throw fights. Vince Morales revealed he was offered $70,000 to intentionally lose. Think about that, one fight would pay more than the median annual salary for a UFC fighter. It shows just how extreme the pay gap really is.
If you try to do this, I've been very vocal and very open about this. We will be your worst enemy. We will immediately go after you, guns a-blazing, with the FBI and whoever else we need to get. And we will do everything we can to make sure you go to...
Dana White's anger makes sense. Fight fixing threatens the integrity of the sport. But what he overlooks is obvious. If fighters were paid fairly, $70,000 wouldn't tempt anyone. It would be small compared to their actual earnings. Fans quickly pointed this out on social media, mocking the idea of UFC fighters getting $250 to fight, a $250 win bonus, and then being shocked that someone would throw a fight for $70K. The FBI's investigation grew, with reports indicating over 100 UFC bouts had suspicious betting patterns. White dismissed it as clickbait, but the questions were already out there.
You see people out there talking, oh, there's hundreds of fights under it's total usual clickbait. IC360 are very quick.
An important clarification, journalist Harry Mack didn't say hundreds of fights were under formal investigation. He said hundreds of bouts were flagged by betting monitors. That doesn't mean guilt, it simply signals suspicious activity worth checking. Still, seeing so many fights flagged is alarming. This isn't the UFC's first betting scandal. In 2022, Derek Batwas Minor lost a fight amid massive bets placed against him due to a leaked injury. His coach, James Krause, who had previously trained Isaac Dolgeron, was suspended for offshore betting connections. The UFC responded by banning all fighters from betting on UFC events and cutting ties with Krause-affiliated gyms.
A couple years ago, whenever it was, that investigation is still ongoing and now will be a part of this investigation.
That's right, the 2022 investigation was never closed. It's still ongoing and now ties into the 2025 scandal. Dana White confirmed he met FBI Director Kash Patel twice, and agents were present at UFC headquarters. Here's where it gets controversial. White has personal ties to Donald Trump, having spoken at Republican conventions and donated to his campaigns. Patel, the current FBI director, also has close connections to Trump. Analysts like Luke Thomas have questioned whether this could create a conflict of interest. Would the FBI really investigate the UFC fully if it risks embarrassing Dana White, a friend of the president?
Do I think that the FBI agents on the ground are going to do a good job? I have no reason to think that they wouldn't. Do I think that Kash Patel is going to go out of his way to make the UFC look bad if he needs?
Thomas doubts the investigation will fully hold powerful figures accountable given these connections. Agree or not, it raises serious questions about transparency and accountability.
It's like, you're seeing things out on the internet where like fighters are coming out and going, "Oh, I was approached. Really?
Dana White is right to be frustrated that fighters didn't report these approaches sooner. But context matters. Low-paid fighters, struggling to survive, might be tempted by life-changing money and hesitant to report it to an organization that already underpays them. Many fighters also fear retaliation. The UFC has a history of cutting those who speak out about pay or working conditions. The truth is, betting scandals and fighter pay are deeply connected. When athletes can't live on their legitimate earnings, they become vulnerable. This isn't excusing wrongdoing. It's about understanding the system that makes it possible.
You might imagine a higher end UFC fighter to make. They make, they're good enough to make it to the UFC, but not good enough to make money in the UFC. And that's kind of these people who are.
Analysts point out that fighters targeted in these schemes aren't stars like Conor McGregor or John Jones. They're mid to lower tier athletes, skilled enough for the UFC, but not making real money. In response, Dana White introduced a new policy: fighters under investigation cannot compete until cleared. It's a step for integrity, but it doesn't fix the root problem: low pay that leaves fighters vulnerable. Fans quickly connected the dots online. Low pay creates opportunity for exploitation. The scandal also revealed the UFC knew about suspicious betting before the Dolgeron fight and allowed it to proceed, raising questions about the organization's role in the situation.
That was the time to pull the bout. That was the moment to pull the bout. If they needed to kill time, they can kill time on the broadcast. If they need to explain whatever they need to say, it was pulled for undisclosed reasons and then
critics argue that by letting the Dolgeron fight continue despite warnings, the UFC may have unintentionally facilitated a fixed fight. And it wasn't even a main event, a low-stakes card that could have been cancelled with minimal impact. Dolgeron remains under investigation, innocent until proven guilty, but the optics are bad. Even Dana White admitted it looks terrible. Then came the $7.7 billion, 7-year media deal with Paramount and CBS in August 2025, averaging $1.1 billion per year. US fans lost pay-per-view, moving most events to Paramount Plus, with major cards on CBS. White called it a huge win for fighters, promising pay increases, but specifics were vague. Bonuses might rise from the $50,000 standard since 2006, a small gesture. Base pay and revenue sharing? No clear details. Analysts quickly noted that even generous bonus increases would barely touch the revenue gap. John S. Nash projected a $75,000 bonus hike would total only $4.3 million, tiny compared to $1.1 billion yearly UFC revenue. Former champion George S. St. Pierre criticized the deal, saying removing PPV takes away leverage fighters once had to negotiate revenue shares. The UFC claims it's negotiating new deals for affected fighters, but the details remain unclear. Dana White has openly rejected full transparency on fighter pay. In a September 2025 GQ interview, he argued that public pay would cause jealousy and drama, even though every other major sport publishes salaries without issue. White often highlights outliers like Jim Miller, but median fighter pay tells a very different story.
For us to have that conversation about the Rodting fight, is how it should be. It should be like a marriage, right? It should be like, hey, we want you to fight Rodtang for the world title. And I'm like, you know what? I appreciate that, but I think that's deserved for somebody else.
This is a fighter sharing his experience with One Championship, a rival organization. The difference compared to the UFC is striking.